Imagine this: a teenage princess trembling in a cold stone chamber, surrounded not by family or friends but by strangers. She is about to be stripped, inspected, and judged. Not for a crime, but for the most private part of her body. And the verdict? It will decide the fate of empires, the survival of dynasties, and her own life. This was not a nightmare, it was reality for medieval queens. Don't skip a second, because what happened to these queens was darker than any horror story. Watch till the very end and then share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love uncovering hidden history, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. The Europe of the Middle Ages was ruled by monarchs, of course, but also by alliances, dynasties, and the ever-watchful power of the church. In that world, a queen's body was not her own. It belonged to her family, to her future husband, and, finally, to her kingdom. Marriages at court were never merely about love or companionship. It was an agreement between empires, a handshake that would signify decades of peace or years of bloodshed. But first the groom had to fiancé this contract, and in a disturbing and embarrassing demand, provided the bride could show she was a virgin. It became known as the Virginity test, a ritual combining superstitious beliefs and patriarchal power politics, alongside one of the most humiliation-prone experiences that a royal woman might be required to undergo. In the one sense, from our modern point of view, obsession with the fact of virginity appears outdated and ridiculous. But to the medieval way of thinking, it was completely logical, because it had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with power. Securing dynastic succession birth legitimacy was key. If a baby was born to a queen, there could be no question about who the father was. The kings. Everything, the fate of a dynasty, often of an entire empire, hinged on this certainty. A tainted queen might bring bastards into the royal bloodline, a disaster, as the medieval mind apprehended disasters. The authority of the Church, the Catholic Church, which dominated nearly all spheres of life, promoted the concept that female purity was sacred. A virgin bride was considered a holy vessel, a dowered blessing to her marriage. By contrast, a woman whose virginity had been lost before marriage was spiritually tainted and ineligible to hold the sacred office of queen. Politics and alliances, royal marriages were more than intimate unions. They were treaties. A French princess married an English prince, and years of peace was the result between two countries. But if on the wedding night it turned out, or rumor went round, that the bride was not a virgin, the whole alliance could go forever. Whole nations could go to war. In other words, a queen's virginity was not simply her private affair, it was the bedrock of medieval geopolitics. The history of virginity tests also dates back to the 12th and 13th centuries, in France and England specifically. There were two types of these tests: private examinations by midwives. A group of older women, often midwives or matrons, were called upon to examine the body of the bride. Their mission was to ascertain if the bride still had her hymen, considered at the time a smoking gun of purity. Public or semi-public examinations. In the most egregious cases, with a great deal at stake politically, exams were administered in the presence of multiple observers, male doctors, nobility, and sometimes even the royal court. It was enough to humiliate the bride that she was not only robbed of her dignity, but also of her privacy, even before she'd begun to act her part as queen. Almost never were these investigations about truth. They were about control. If the queen was declared pure by either midwives or doctors, the marriage proceeded. Otherwise, the union could be broken immediately, and the woman would be disgraced for the rest of her life. One of the early instances was at the marriage of Anne of Bohemia with King Richard II of England in the late 14th century. Matrons of the English court performed a physical inspection of Anne before the marriage to check that she was a virgin. When the women verified her virginity, the marriage alliance was permitted. For Anne, who was then aged only in her teens, it was not simply a medical examination. It was a rite of humiliation. She had been a bargaining chip for kingdoms, her body a subject of scrutiny, not for her own well-being, but for the continuity of England's royal line. The virginity test was not just a bodily invasion. It was a psychological weapon. Brides frequently wept, thirsting over the humiliation of being examined like cattle by strangers. Most, in fact, feared that they would be falsely accused of impurity. Some marriages were annulled on suspicion alone, destroying reputations and alliances along with them. A queen could live her life in the shadow of this humiliation. Her value as a ruler not rooted in her intelligence, her diplomacy, her leadership, but in a frail piece of flesh inside her. The Church justified the virginity test as a means to maintain divine order. God favored a virgin queen and cursed a non-virgin by sin and misfortune upon the throne. But the Church's role wasn't just spiritual. Through this rite, the clergy strengthened their sway over the politics of the court. They made themselves the essential mediators of legitimacy, both moral and powerful aspects of judgment. Virginity tests, in subsequent centuries, were not just tradition but a political tool. A bride pronounced not a virgin might be rejected, dishonoring her family and unraveling alliances. A tarred and feathered queen was subject to public humiliation and could be divorced or executed. A would-be dynasty's enemies could counter claims to legitimacy by spreading rumors about a queen's chastity, tearing apart kingdoms without drawing a sword. So virginity was not only about the woman herself, it was about nations surviving. The virginity test did not grow from medicine or morality, but from fear and politics and control. The purity of a queen was an emblem of dynasty security, a divine blessing, and a political stability. Her body was not her own, but a battleground on which nations gambled their future. This was only the beginning. What began as private inspections would ultimately lead to public shaming, terrifying physical tests, and, in some cases, even court proceedings where queens indicted for impurity would be put on trial. But the next chapter will delve into precisely how these tests were conducted in gruesome, blow-by-blow detail, and the nightmarish fallout for the women subjected to them. Stay with me, because the secrets I'm about to reveal were buried in royal archives for centuries. Watch until the end, then tell me what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next untold story of history. How such tests were actually done. Shed no tears for the peons to queens in gilded crowns. This was the side of royalty that most history books never dared to describe. In order to demonstrate her purity, a princess or queen-to-be was frequently subjected to a humiliating ritual. The test might be administered in private, in a cold chamber by midwives, or it might be chillingly public, in the presence of courtiers, doctors, priests. Either way, it was a process that left scars far more profound than anyone could see. The examination typically started with a call for witnesses. These were the choices made not to protect the woman, but to ensure the integrity of the test. Midwives and matrons were believed to be experts in the functioning of the female body. In high-profile royal marriages, male physicians were usually present. Sometimes nobles and clerics were even invited to watch, so that no one could later dispute the bride's purity. For the young bride, quite often still a teenager, this marked the start of a nightmare. The content of the inspection differed from time to time and place to place, but the procedure was often brutal. Examination of the hymen. The midwives would look for the hymen. That was ultimate proof of virginity. If it seemed intact, the girl passed. If anything, she could be condemned. Sure, science has since taught us that the hymen is an unreliable marker, but in the Middle Ages, it could make or break a queen's destiny. Bodily signs of virginity. Many thought that a virgin might have firmer breasts, tighter skin, or even a certain way of walking. Some said a virgin's urine was clearer, or that she possessed a particular smell. These preposterous signs were considered evidence. The two-finger test. Sometimes a doctor or midwife would try to insert fingers into the bride's vagina to feel for tightness. This was debased and one of the most painful parts of the ritual. Bleeding as proof. A few kings required proof on their wedding night. Blood on the marriage sheets. If blood was not there, it could raise suspicion, annulment, or worse. After the examination was performed, the witnesses would announce the bride was either pure or impure. A verdict favoring the source of the wedding and treaties between kingdoms safe. A decision against a defendant generally meant disgrace, annulment, or expulsion. The woman's name potentially could be forever ruined and her family disgraced. At other times, the result was not so much the truth as it was politics. If the big men wanted the marriage, the bride would be ruled pure in any case. If they wanted to terminate the alliance, she would then mysteriously be corrupted. One notorious one was Joan of France, the daughter of King Louis XVIII. Her husband, Louis of Orléans, later King Louis XIII of France, tried to have their marriage annulled. The argument? Joan was assumed to be imperfect for consumption, or defective. She might not have been a virgin when they married. Physicians, clergy, and others were dragged into the matter, and Joan was humiliated by medical examinations. In the end, however, Louis managed to have the marriage annulled. Joan was left aside, her dignity trampled upon. Sometimes the test did not even remain in private chambers. There are instances that at times the result was declared publicly or rumors spread through the courts. For a young queen, such secrets of impurity could ruin her reputation for good. Worse, the evidence was frequently manufactured. Sheets could be stained with animal blood to demonstrate virginity. A queen could be bribed by enemies to be declared not pure by physicians. In such courts, truth was much less important than power. Think about what that must mean for a 15-year-old girl who's being subjected to it, stripped of dignity before strangers, touched and prodded into them in ways that violated her most personal sanctuaries. The orifices that made her a woman. Her whole future depending on the opinion of someone else. Some queens are known to have fainted during such investigations. Still others spent the remainder of their lives with the stains seared into their memory. For many queens of the past, however, the real test was not won in the chamber but in the bedchamber, on their wedding night. Sheets were inspected for blood. The courtiers remained in the anteroom, hungry to hear if the marriage was consummated. To the court was shown in proof occasionally a bed linen with the blood upon it. Not being able to give blood would result in dissolution, scandal, or death. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, faced tremendous stress to prove her marriage to Henry II of France had been consummated. For years, her infertility was attributed to supposed flaws in her purity. The virginity test was never a medical test. It was a test of control and a test of humiliation and a test of politics. For medieval queens, it was the catch-22 of power. Pass, and you were a pawn of power. Fail, and you faced disgrace, annulment, or exile. The ritual was more than a purity test. It was a public spectacle, a ruthless performance staged to safeguard kings and kingdoms, to hell with women's dignity. But the tale doesn't stop there. In Part 3, we step into the actual lives of queens who survived these tests and what it did to them. Anne of Bohemia, Mary Tudor, Catherine de' Medici, and others. Women whose reputations were built, demolished, or weaponized by the gruesome virginity tests of the past. Don't look away, because the darkest part of this story is still ahead. If you leave now, you'll miss the shocking truth history tried to hide. Isabella of France, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, was married at the tender age of 12 to Edward II of England. Her marriage was to be the union of two mighty kingdoms. But before she could even be crowned, one of the most humiliating things a queen could be subjected to, a virginity test. English courtiers murmured doubts. Was she really unspoiled? Was France handing England a pure bride? In medieval politics, a woman's body was not her own. It was a pact between powers, a letter of testimony of political reliability. So doctors and noblewomen were dispatched to inspect her. Picture the child Isabella stripped of all clothing and dignity, being poked, prodded, and publicly disgraced by men in order to prove worth. It appears from contemporary document that there were investigations conducted prior to her bedding of Edward VIII. But Isabella did not stop at disgrace. Edward II was disinterested in his bride. He openly favored his intimate male companions, such as Piers Gaveston. The bedding ceremony, a public event where lords and ladies watched as the couple were put to bed, culminated in rumors of Edward's indifference. The test had proved Isabella's virginity, and her torment had only just begun. Later she would be derided as a she-wolf for defying Edward. But behind the fierce name lay a girl whom the system had been violated, just as though it had been visited, measured not by its wisdom but by its flesh, and whose name is written in our history not as Isabel, but as She-Wolf. Several centuries later, Italian noblewoman Catherine de' Medici would marry the future King Henry II of France. Catherine's family was wealthy, powerful, and feared, but in French court politics, she was always the outsider. The night of her marriage, all physicians and attendants at court waited without in the chamber. They weren't waiting for love or laughter. They were waiting for evidence. Sheets had to be shown, blood-stained, to prove that Catherine had been untouched before her husband. But there was a hitch. Catherine's body let her down. She was not able to conceive for more than 10 years. Gossip raced through the town. Other virgins, just as her military husband, was she a virgin at marriage? Had the tests been faked? Catherine's incapacity to bear an heir became an erotic fetish with the French court. Priests offered spiritual remedies, doctors provided odd potions, and Catherine was subjected to painful examinations. At one point, surgeons examined her body to diagnose her alleged infertility, tests that bore a chilling resemblance to the virginity rituals that accompanied her wedding night. Her humiliation became political. Court rivals alleged she had used cunning at her marriage to Henry, insisting that she had not been a virgin at marriage. Some murmured that she was barren since she had committed a sin before marriage. Catherine had also spent years in humiliating infertility before she finally produced an heir. But her early humiliation had left its scars. Behind her later reputation as an ice-cold queen mother was a woman who'd been cut up, doubted, denigrated, as a bride, later as a mother. Mary Stuart, also known as Mary, Queen of Scots, was also a victim of medieval fetish with female purity. Commonly married in haste was the 15-year-old Mary, who was not just a bride, but flesh and blood evidence of an alliance between Scotland and France. The French court required her to provide evidence of her virginity. Accounts persist of midwives inspecting her prior to her wedding, and courtiers starting scurrilous rumors about her fitness. When Francis died young, Mary was compelled to marry again. And each time the same echoes dogged her. Was she still pure? Was her corpse unpolluted by other men to ensure the legitimacy of her next husband's heirs? Worst of all, when Mary went back to Scotland, her enemies would turn these doubts against her. When her second husband, Lord Darnley, was found dead under dubious circumstances, her enemies used it to paint her as a cuckolded adulteress who deserved to be dethroned. Pamphlets were distributed throughout Europe ridiculing her sexuality and even calling for invasive examinations to prove her guilt. It was not a one-off for Mary. Virginity tests were a curse that dogged her whole reign. They never treated her as a queen, only as a woman whose body was a battleground of politics. These were not tests of medicine for queens, they were weapons. They governed women's bodies to fulfill men's desires. They crushed royal brides into submission. They provided kings and courts the pretext to divorce, exile, and even execute a queen. A queen who did not pass a test could be stripped of her crown overnight. Anne of Cleves, the German princess who married Henry VIII, became a public laughingstock when Henry declared that she was not a virgin. But while Henry spared her life, she lost her role and power. These were rituals at which women's most intimate dignity was made a public spectacle. Blood-stained bedding was being paraded in the courts as public trophies. Queens became exhibits, not rulers. What the history books don't always show us are the mental scars. Consider being a teenage girl, growing up in a world in which your worth, your safety, your very right to exist depended on whether or not strangers decreed your body pure. Some queens resisted silently, some endured with tears, and some, like Catherine de' Medici, converted their grief into ruthless power. Some, like Mary Stuart, were destroyed by it. But all of them were trapped. What you've heard so far is only the beginning, but the real horror is about to unfold, where the most renowned queens of the royal courts were changed forever. So don't take your eyes off the screen, because the ultimate truth is coming next. The medieval royal courts were never truly quiet. They throbbed not with laughter or music, but with whispers, cold, sharp whispers that could raise a queen to untouchable glory in one moment and drag her into ruin the next. By the later Middle Ages, virginity tests were no longer about proving a young bride's purity before marriage. They had morphed into something far more sinister, a weapon, invisible yet devastating, used to control queens, to humiliate them, and sometimes to destroy them completely. The test itself was cruel, but the true horror was in how it was wielded. Queens became pawns on a political chessboard, and their bodies were treated like pieces that kings, courtiers, and rivals could manipulate at will. In 1308, Isabella of France, a child of only 12, was married off to King Edward II of England. The wedding was grand, a spectacle of jewels and banners, but the gossip began before the feast even ended. "The French bride is too young, unproven, untested," the whispers said. When Isabella reached maturity, the court demanded proof of her worthiness. Records hide the details behind polished Latin phrases, but historians believe that rival nobles pressured Edward to order humiliating examinations of his queen. Imagine the terror: a teenage girl, a crowned queen, forced to stand before stern matrons, her body inspected for signs of untouched purity. But Isabella's ordeal did not end there. Her husband, Edward II, preferred the company of his favorites, men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, ignoring her completely. Rumors turned poisonous. The queen is untouched, unwanted, perhaps not pure at all. The humiliation hardened Isabella. Years later, when she invaded England and deposed Edward in one of history's most shocking coups, chroniclers branded her the she-wolf of France. But can we really blame her? She had been paraded, mocked, inspected, and betrayed. The so-called virginity test had been the first wound in a lifetime of vengeance. By the 1500s, these tests were no longer isolated humiliations. They were institutionalized. Catherine de' Medici, widow of France's King Henry II, knew this all too well. Her daughters, sent across Europe as political brides, were inspected before foreign marriages. Picture it: a 15-year-old princess, trembling as royal physicians examined her body, her value reduced to a written certificate declaring her untainted. These certificates were sealed like military treaties, traded between kings as if chastity itself were political currency. But Catherine was no victim. She learned to turn the weapon against others. Rumors suggest she orchestrated tests, not just for her daughters, but also for ladies-in-waiting she suspected of betrayal. Ambassadors recorded their disgust. No secret is safe in Catherine's court, not even a maiden's bedchamber. For Catherine, purity was not morality, it was power. Few queens suffered as cruelly as Mary, Queen of Scots. At 15, she married the Dauphin of France and was hailed as the perfect virgin bride. But when her husband died young and she returned to Scotland, the whispers followed her. Her second marriage to Lord Darnley quickly crumbled, and political enemies weaponized the oldest accusation in the book: adultery. To prove her innocence, Mary faced threats of another humiliating inspection. Though she resisted, the damage was done. Pamphlets circulated claiming she had been easily corrupted. Her reputation collapsed, and with it, her crown. Years later, when she was executed in England, her enemies cheered. Yet her downfall had begun long before the executioner's axe. It began the day whispers of her chastity were first questioned. Across Europe, the same story repeated. Queens rose or fell, not by their political skill or their alliances, but by the fragile thread of their supposed purity. If she passed the test, she was celebrated. If she failed, or even if a rumor claimed she had failed, her life, her children, and her legacy could be destroyed overnight. Historians now believe that most of these tests were theater, symbolic rituals more than medical reality. The true weapon wasn't the examination, it was the accusation. A single whisper of "she is not pure" could topple a dynasty. And yet, some queens found ways to fight back. Elizabeth I of England was one of them. Foreign rulers pressed for proof of her virginity, but she never allowed it. Instead, she turned the very rumor into her greatest weapon. Declaring herself the Virgin Queen, she transformed chastity into a symbol of independence, wielding it not as weakness, but as power. Unlike Mary of Scots, Elizabeth mastered the game. She built an empire from a reputation, but even in her triumph, the bitter truth remained. Her worth, her identity, her legend was still chained to the idea of purity. By the dawn of the modern age, virginity tests faded from European courts, but the scars they left behind lingered. Some queens had been humiliated, others had been destroyed. A few had found ways to turn the weapon against their enemies. Yet one of the darkest stories remained untold, a queen whose body was not only tested in life, but judged again after death. Her purity dissected, her dignity stripped away, even in the grave. And this brings us to the end of this dark royal truth. But now I want to hear from you. Which queen's story shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this history moved you, don't forget to share the video. The medieval obsession with queen's purity did not stop at life. It pursued them into the grave. The whispers of virginity, chastity, and moral worth were so powerful that even a dead queen's body could be summoned as evidence. What began as humiliating inspections in life became grotesque dissections in death. And in this horror, one woman's story eclipses all others. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad. Born in 1479, Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and sent Columbus across the Atlantic. From childhood, Joanna was never seen as just a girl. She was a tool for dynastic ambition. At 16, she was betrothed to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a glittering match meant to tie Spain to the Habsburg dynasty. Their marriage was stormy. Philip was unfaithful, and Joanna's jealousy, recorded eagerly by hostile chroniclers, was exaggerated into madness. By the time she became queen in 1504, she was already branded as unstable. Yet, was she truly insane? Or was madness simply another convenient accusation, another weapon like the virginity test? After her mother Isabella's death, Joanna inherited Castile, but power-hungry men, her father Ferdinand, her husband Philip, and later her son Charles V, found her inconvenient. A ruling queen who could make her own choices threatened their ambitions. The solution was simple: declare her unfit. Court whispers grew. Joanna was too emotional, too jealous, too unruly. They confined her, first under her husband's watch, then in the castle of Tordesillas, where she remained imprisoned for nearly 50 years. Her reputation was destroyed not with armies, but with words. Just as virginity tests could unmake a queen, so too could the rumor of madness. When Joanna died in 1555, one might expect her torment to end. But no. Even in death, her body was treated not as sacred, but as evidence. Chroniclers record that physicians were summoned to examine her corpse. Why? Because whispers once again questioned her body. Had she been faithful? Was she truly the mother of her children? Could her madness have been the result of impurity, witchcraft, or lust? Her body, cold, silent, powerless, was cut open. A queen who had been caged in life was dissected in death, her purity still under suspicion. Unlike Elizabeth I, who turned virginity into a weapon of power, Joanna never had control. Her body, her womb, her sanity, all were claimed by others. Joanna's fate was not unique. Across Europe, queens' corpses were sometimes disturbed, not to honor them, but to answer political questions. In France, embalming often included inspection of the womb to prove the queen had not carried a bastard child. In England, Anne Boleyn's enemies spread rumors after her execution that her body was deformed, as if her alleged sexual crimes had marked her flesh. In Scandinavia, queens' remains were sometimes reburied after rumors of infidelity or witchcraft arose, their skeletons inspected for signs of sin. The obsession was not with medicine, it was about control. A living queen could protest, resist, or rule. A dead queen could not. Her silent body became a blank page upon which men could write whatever truth they needed. The cruelty of posthumous purity tests reveals something chilling. Queens never truly owned their bodies. In life they were inspected, judged, paraded. In death they were still dissected, still accused. Imagine the irony. Kings could father dozens of illegitimate children and be praised for virility. Queens, by contrast, lived under constant suspicion. Their honor was fragile, their power conditional, their very flesh subject to invasion. And yet, these stories survived not as tales of justice, but as cautionary whispers, reminders that a queen, no matter how high her throne, could be reduced to nothing more than her body. Joanna of Castile became remembered as Juana la Loca, the Mad Queen. That label, repeated for centuries, became her cage even in history. Just as virginity tests reduced queens to their chastity, so too did madness reduce Joanna to a caricature. But perhaps the truth is different. Perhaps she was not mad, but angry. Not unstable, but silenced. Not unworthy, but feared. Her tragedy shows the full cruelty of the system. Whether alive or dead, queens were never free. By the 17th century, the practice of virginity tests began to lose its grip on European courts. The Enlightenment slowly questioned such rituals, replacing whispers with science. But the scars remained. Queens like Isabella, Mary Stuart, Catherine's daughters, Elizabeth I and Joanna of Castile had already lived and died under its shadow. Their stories form a dark tapestry, proof that power and humiliation were woven together, that the crown itself could not shield a woman from the weaponization of her own body. When we look back now, it is not only their crowns we see, but their suffering. The queens of Europe were not just rulers or brides. They were victims of a relentless system that treated purity as power, rumor as law, and bodies as battlefields. The virginity test was never truly about virginity. It was about control. And for queens like Joanna of Castile, that control lasted even beyond the grave.